As my steep learning curve continues, one thing to remember is have a pair of glasses here before it starts, because if I can't read what's going on, I'm just going to have to wake it up as I go along. So for those of you who were inside at the beginning of Mass, yes, I couldn't read what I was trying to say, but thank you, Father David, who was whispering in my ear. Problem is, it turns out I'm going deaf as well, so that just adds to the thing too. And I hope you don't know when I'm supposed to wear this, because I've been getting this wrong as well, left and right. So I'm kind of looking forward to tomorrow when I arrive in Lourdes with HCPT, because there it's absolute chaos. If anybody's been with HCPT, it's just a rammy and chaos, so the niceties don't matter, so I can get away with doing what I like and nobody will notice anything. And before I was appointed down to here in Galloway, I was actually on the committee that was coming up with the theme for this year. Each year when we travel to Lourdes, you know, there are groups going from Scotland, there are some locally from here, from England, Wales, Ireland, the US, other parts of Europe travel as well. And different regions have an opportunity to lead the week. And this year is the Scottish region leading the week in Lourdes. So the first thing I have to do is come up with a theme. And the theme we have, you've got a picture of it in there actually in your booklet, is Let Your Light Shine. I would love to take the credit for that, but it was another priest, Father Breslin, up in the Motherwell Diocese, that came up with it. I was on the committee that were looking at how do we develop this theme and then come up with materials for the week ahead. And the thing we were looking at is what kind of image we would use. And first of all, we were looking at the image of a lighthouse. It wasn't that one, the one we finished with isn't what we started with. We looked at the image of a lighthouse thinking, well, Scotland, you know, with the coastland and light and all that, and the idea of the lighthouse being the thing that brings people safely home as well, all sorts of things we could do with that. But it just didn't feel quite right. And we were, bouncing around some ideas, and what we started to focus on, unsurprisingly, is tonight's celebration, because this is the most important celebration in the church's year, and that particular moment when the Paschal candle is lit, and then when others have their candle, you had your candles lit and stood with them. And we started to then hone in on that image that left us with what we have there. The girl is called Katie, and we're going to have a real live Katie in Lourdes that's going to travel around so people can get pictures taken with her and so on. And the importance of that image was that the light that Katie is shining out isn't hers to start with. It's not a light that comes from within, it's a reflected light. That you see the light that she's holding reflected on her face, and then others can see that. Exactly the same way as when I lit the Paschal candle, and that representing the light of Christ, and then you hold that light, and that light of Christ is reflected on you and us for others to see. So that's where we really honed in, because we wanted to say, it's all very well to say, let your light shine. What do we mean by that light? And that light is the light of Christ and the life of Christ. And our job is to let that reflect off of us. Just like the moon reflects the light of the sun and lights us up, so also then we are called to reflect the light of Christ. And that's the theme that we're taking this week. And it is obviously the theme at the heart of Easter, the light in the darkness. But to get to this point this evening, it's taken us a while. And we've come through other things to get here, to this point of the light of Christ and the resurrection. We started way back 40-odd days ago, and it started with the wilderness, with Christ going into the wilderness, and for us to reflect on that, and us to go into the desert, to go away and to reflect and take time and reflect on ourselves and reflect on sin. And we began with listening to the devil tempting Christ. But while we began with that, the devil didn't have the last word. While we began with the wilderness, that wilderness was just for a time. And while we began and continued through Lent reflecting on sin, that wasn't to be the last word either. And we came through Lent, and we began Holy Week and continued our celebrations. And we reflected on the terrible things that happened to Christ, on the betrayal of Christ, betrayed by a friend, brought before the authorities, beaten, taken to be put to death and crucified. And there we heard the wail of Christ, The words that were torn from his lips, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The human Christ understood the depth of what people can feel and endure, the suffering that many have to go through. The human Christ felt that, and the human Christ felt that sense of the absence of God. But those weren't the last words either. It didn't end with that. Darkness came down, but that wasn't the end of the story either. And silence came over the whole land. And that silence was the silence that's reflected today on Holy Saturday. It's supposed to be a time of silence, the kind of deep breath that the world takes, which is a deep breath of waiting. And into that silence comes the last word. None of those other things are the last word. The devil and sin and wilderness and suffering and death. No, after all of that, we hear the last words. Christ is risen. And the very last words are actually the last thing you will say tonight. At the end of Mass, when the deacon will say, "Go in the peace of Christ," the last thing you will say, "Hallelujah. Praise God." That's the last word. That is how we let our light shine. That we have understood that we come through all the darkness and the sin and the suffering and the death itself. But while the human Christ died, the divine Christ rose, and his humanity rose with it. And so our humanity rises with it too. And so nothing can overcome that. No darkness or sin or devil or hurt or suffering or death, nothing can overcome God, because God has the last word. Christ is risen. And we are to reflect that by not just saying Alleluia, but by being an Alleluia, being a praise of God. That if we live out what we've experienced, if we understand that this is true, that God is and God is risen, and that he's done this for our sake, then our only response is to praise God, to give thanks, to be that Alleluia that says, "Come and hear what has happened," so that others can see in us the joy of the resurrection, the joy of Christ. This is what it means to let our light shine. We are called to look closely at that light, so that when people see our faces, they see not just our faces, but the light of Christ reflected off of that. So that when they hear our Alleluia, they might want to know what that means. What it means is, none of those other things have the last word. God has the last word. Christ is risen.